All right, folks. Welcome to the second live broadcast for International Flamingo Day today. It's good to see that we've still got people in the audience coming along. And again, it's my ugly mug again, apologies. But it's slightly different from what we did this morning, where we were talking about flamingos in the zoo. This afternoon, and I'm using British time here, wherever you are in the world, but this afternoon in the United Kingdom, we are going to be talking about wild flamingos and flamingo conservation. So it's my great pleasure to introduce my esteemed colleague, a member of the steering committee of the Flamingo Specialist Group, Dr. Felicity Arengo from the American Museum of Natural History. And I want to say it's good afternoon to you as well, Felicity, in the US, if I'm correct.
Yes.
Just about.
Good afternoon, Paul, and everyone else that's a flamingo enthusiast in the audience. Everyone, I hope, loves flamingos. Yes, I'm on the East Coast, so it's just about a little afternoon for me.
Lovely stuff. Well, thank you very much for coming along. It's great to have you here, Felicity, and talk about flamingos in the wild. And I know that you were at a symposium earlier today that was all about flamingo conservation as well. So you are social media pro for doing so much of this online virtual conferencing in one day. And thank you for getting involved in International Flamingo Day as well. So I have some questions about flamingos and flamingo conservation in the wild that I'm going to pitch to Felicity. But if you in the audience have any questions about flamingos, anything at all that you would like to know about these remarkable and wonderful birds, pop them in a comment on the video and we can answer them as we go. So I'd just like to start off, Felicity, by saying that the floor is yours. So feel free to give everybody a brief introduction to who you are and what you do and the flamingo work that you have been involved in.
Sure. So currently I am the Associate Director at the Center for Biodiversity and Conservation at the American Museum of Natural History based in New York. And I'm also the Americas Coordinator for the IUCN Flamingo Specialist Group, as Paul mentioned. And I'm also a founding member of a South American Flamingo Conservation Group, which is the Grupo Conservación de Flamencos Altoandinos, or GCFA, which is a regional initiative of countries in the range of the two high Andean species, the Andean highland species, the Puna and the Andean flamingo. So those four countries are Argentina, Bolivia, Chile, and Peru. And I first started working with flamingos in 1992. So if you could do some quick math, that was almost 30 years ago, which is hard to believe. It's been really a great run. And in 1992 was also the first time that I saw flamingos in the wild in Mexico. Wow. In the coastal lagoons of the Yucatan Peninsula. And I studied Caribbean flamingos or American flamingos for a master's thesis, which then I continued to a PhD dissertation and just really became fascinated. And since then has turned into a lifelong interest and pursuit. And then when I finished my PhD and I graduated, I became involved with a South American Flamingo Conservation Initiative, this GCFA conservation group that I mentioned, and have been mostly working in South America with the three species in Southern South America for the past 20 plus years.
So your expertise covers 4 of the 6 species then?
Right. So I work in the American continent. Yeah. In a diversity of wetlands, though, you know. So we have. I could talk a little bit about flamingo habitats. They're aquatic birds, so their feet are pretty much constantly wet. Their habitats are wetlands, and although there are some similarities in the types of wetlands that the 6 species can be found, these are shallow, saline wetlands. You can find these habitats in a variety of different places. So it can be the coastal lagoons, like in the Caribbean, or it can be the salt pans in Africa, or it can be the highland wetlands in the Andes, or it can be the lowland agricultural wetlands in central Argentina, which are also saline. So there's a diversity of this type of shallow saline wetland.
And what's the kind of main difference then in terms of the ecology of the Caribbean flamingos that you would have been studying for your PhD and master's thesis and the kind of three more mountainous South American flamingos? Do they have different requirements in terms of the wetlands that they would like to frequent?
Actually, they're pretty similar, and this is flamingo ecology for the six species and throughout the world. Flamingos are what we call nomadic or itinerant, in that they disperse among wetlands and they'll use a wetland patch. The wetlands are dispersed in a matrix of other types of habitats. And they can be in a wetland for a day or a week or a few months, and then they'll move and disperse to other habitats. And this behavior applies to the six species. So there's a small population of Caribbean or American flamingos in the Galapagos, in the Pacific, in the islands there, and they're showing that same behavior at a smaller scale. There's only 500 birds in that population, and they're moving around from one wetland to another. In South America, we have that movement amongst wetlands connecting different habitats at a scale of 1,500 kilometers. So it's similar. Tracking studies in Africa have shown the same thing, where we have flamingos moving around from Central Africa to Southern Africa. We have flamingos moving around the wetlands in the Mediterranean towards out to Asia, to India. So this movement from one wetland to another, this itinerant behavior is a signature of all flamingos.
And would you say that this nomadic nature that they have can be a challenge to their conservation and to the conservation of their wetlands?
Exactly. So you can imagine that you can't concentrate your conservation efforts on a single wetland, right? So you can have a protected area, you can have a national park that's a wetland, but if conditions change, the flamingo will go and fly to another wetland that might not be a protected area. So we work on conservation at a landscape scale, where what we're trying to conserve is that dynamic of that, what we call a shifting mosaic of available habitat, that conserves, that some habitat will have the resources available for flamingos at any point in time as their needs change throughout the season. And because they're shallow wetlands, they're also highly variable. So if there's a lot of rain, the water levels can go up, and that might exclude flamingos from feeding. That might cover up a nesting area so that they can't nest, and they'll have to go find another nesting area. So those fluctuations in water levels will drive some of these movements.
So they move very much based on the resources that they want at a particular given time.
Mm-hmm.
So one of the things that we are focusing on International Flamingo Day this year, Felicity, is the fact that there are 6 different kinds of flamingo, not just one pink one that stands on one leg, but they come in a range of different species. And my question to you, which is what I asked my guest earlier, is what is your favourite species of flamingo and why? And you are allowed to have a favourite for the purposes of today, even though there might be other animals that you like too. But do you have a favourite flamingo, and why is that?
That's a tough question. And I have to say, to your disappointment, that I'm not sure I have a favorite, because they all have their charms. So, sometimes I see a Caribbean flamingo, it's really probably the pinkest one, has a vibrant pink, it's almost orange, and you see it at sunset when that orange light is hitting, and you're like, wow, this must be the most beautiful flamingo. And then, you're in a beautiful landscape in the Andes with snow-capped mountains, and you see the Andean flamingo, which has this beautiful, very crimson plumage on its neck, and they have these bright yellow legs. And you think, well, no, this one, I think right now, this one is the most beautiful one, and this is the coolest one. And then you see the Puna flamingo, and we see these massive courtship marches and displays, and they're calling to each other, and you're like, no, 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 this is my favorite thing about flamingos. And it's just, I can't really single one out. I have to admit, I haven't spent much time with the greater and the lesser flamingos because I work on the American continent. So I've seen them in zoos and in collections. I can brag. I think I can legitimately have this bragging right that I've seen all 6 flamingos in the wild.
That's
So
very impressive.
So yeah. So and but not spent much time with the greater and lesser that I can think of a moment where I thought that they were, the most beautiful or my favorite. But I'm sure if I did spend time with them, I could come up with that.
No, I think that was a very, very good answer, and I have the same conundrum. But they all have, as you say, their charms, and there might be some things about some species that you're really drawn to, but actually, as a group of birds, they are all incredible in their own special way. So, because I do want to pin you down on a flamingo favourite at some point, then, do you have a favourite thing about them, or something about them that has captured flamingos in your heart? What is it about them that you love so much that has allowed you to devote your life to them? Your professional life, I should say.
Well, they're certainly charismatic and interesting to look at, and sometimes goofy, and sometimes you're watching it and you're like, is this really a bird? Is this that neck, that beak, those those legs, is that actually a bird? And obviously they are birds, but they're also they're very mysterious in a way. Like, they're very popular, charismatic, and we do know a lot about flamingos in the wild and their ecology, but also there are a lot of some basic things that we don't know, so that's kind of the mystery is, what is driving exactly, what are the variables that are really defining where a flamingo decides to land and stay, and for how long, and why, sometimes it's a handful, maybe 20, and why is it sometimes 300, and why is it sometimes 30,000? These questions that seem to be fundamental questions, we actually don't know, and they're kind of hard to study because they're so difficult to mark individuals, and they're so long-lived. So to get a good percentage of the population marked isn't that easy. The greater flamingos in the Mediterranean are the most studied population in that regard, where they've been doing consistently banding, so they can ask those kinds of research questions that have to do with having marked individuals, but otherwise, and sometimes they're in remote places, so it's hard to study them. So there's always something to learn, and when we do learn something, it always generates more questions. So it's just kind of never ending the wonder and the desire to go out there and try and answer these questions.
I think that's another brilliant answer. The mystery of something that is so apparently familiar, I still find quite incredible that, it seems to me that everybody knows that flamingos are pink, they stand on one leg, but as you say, some key facets of their behaviour are still really unsure of what we know about it and why it happens.
They're also great ambassadors for wetland habitat conservation. So, it's a great entry point. We have this beautiful, charismatic bird, but, the fact that they are wetland birds, they're aquatic birds, we can immediately start with that conversation about, wetlands and how threatened they are, and use them as not only as a flagship species or ambassador, but also as a key species where, in conserving flamingos and in their habitats, then presumably we're conserving all the other biodiversity associated with those wetlands, and the wetlands as ecosystem services and their function in terms of purification and stormwater management, etc.
It's another brilliant answer. It's like we planned this, because that kind of flows beautifully into what I wanted to say next. Was you talked about the hook of the flamingo as for the conservation of the wetland more widely. So it might seem to many people that the wild flamingo is quite remote to them, and you said it yourself that they can live in these very inhospitable, far away places. So this is a sort of two-pronged question, I suppose. how did you end up working in flamingo conservation? And if others want to work in flamingo conservation, how could they become the next Dr. Arengo, going around the world, seeing all of the 6 species and having the same bragging rights?
Yeah. I fell into it a little bit by chance, I suppose, but a directed sort of chance, I suppose. I was applying to study for a graduate degree, and I knew that I wanted to work on birds. I knew that I wanted to work on conservation issues, and I wanted to work in Latin America. So those were broadly the things. I'm from Argentina originally, but I had spent a lot of time in the United States. I grew up in both places, but was interested in working in Latin America, going back there and having a professional career, sort of straddling both worlds. And with those rough parameters, I started looking for graduate programs and landed with a professor who was mostly a waterfowl biologist, but was working in Mexico in the coastal wetlands. This was Dr. Guy Baldassare. And he had a couple of students who published papers in the late 70s and 80s on this population in Yucatan. And we started corresponding, and he said, I'm working at this site in Mexico. Would you be interested in studying flamingos? And I was like, I mean, is that like a trick question? So then that's when I went to Yucatan and saw them in the wild, and it just, it just opened up this.
And that's when you fell in love.
Pretty much, yeah.
And so how could somebody go and, as I said, be the future flamingo conservation scientist? What's your kind of top tips, I suppose, for taking this into the next generation of scientists taking this forward?
Mm-hmm. Well, I have a degree in wildlife and in conservation biology. Now, the interesting thing about conservation is that you can approach it, I think, from different disciplines. And in fact, the more multidisciplinary we are, the better.
Mm-hmm.
The better our conservation strategies, the more equitable, the more successful. So, if you're an artist and you're interested in art, we could always use artists that are working in conservation. We do, that we do a lot of communications and social media and writing. You can approach conservation that way. If you're a filmmaker, if you're a social scientist, you can work. All of these wetlands usually have communities associated with them. There are a lot of the social issues that we're dealing with. When we're dealing with some of the threats, there are particular types of threats that require different expertise also to address. So I approach it from the biological and ecology sciences.
Yeah.
But if you're one of those people who are afraid of science or afraid of math, I would suggest, if this is your passion, you can really get at it from a lot of different disciplines.
What a brilliant answer. And it chimes in so nicely with the movement in especially the university system that I'm familiar with, where this multidisciplinary approach is one that they're really pushing to bring in as many people as possible to actually answer, these big questions that are challenging humans and non-human animals into the future.
Mm-hmm.
So, Felicity, my last question for you then is, we've talked about how you would go and be conservation biologist. We've talked about your own experiences. If folks just wanted to do some things at home, some small aspects of behaviour change that could benefit the wild flamingo in some capacity, do you have any top tips or hints to bridge the gap, as it were, between the relative remote audience and the flamingos themselves out in these wild and wonderful wetlands?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so as you said, you just mentioned that we're talking about wetlands in terms of flamingo habitat. As I mentioned, flamingos are aquatic. and they need a diversity of wetland habitats. So I could focus on specific tips related to water, and to maybe if you do have wetlands in your sphere, in your life, in your neighborhood, you can take some steps as a consumer and live more sustainably, but your engagement as a citizen is equally as important. And you don't have to turn your life upside down to make a small difference. If you commit to doing, one or two lifestyle choices that are more sustainable, then, that has a cumulative effect and a positive impact, not only over your life, but as a community, if we all make these choices. So in your home, there are different ways you can conserve water: taking shorter showers, turning off the faucet, making sure you don't have any leaks, running washers with full loads, switching to low flow shower heads. Here in New York State, there's a program that the Department of Environmental Conservation has where they give low flow shower heads. I believe they still do that. There's also ways to make your toilets low flow. And that's how you can cut down on use of water in your house. If you have outside space, like a garden, you can collect rainwater just for watering, for washing. You can water your plants at night when it's cooler, not during the warmest time of day when most of it evaporates anyway. And then, not only be mindful of your use, but then what are you putting down the drains? Because eventually that wastewater also ends up back in the water cycle. So, be aware of what your downstream effects are of water use.
Yeah.
So those are some things you could do individually in your household, but you could also be an engaged citizen and volunteer with local wetland cleanup and restoration efforts. You can support candidates for office that have conservation platforms. You can ask, your local candidates what their wetland conservation actions will be, should they be elected. Be involved in your town conservation and planning boards. I've been participating in my town meetings, and the wetland ordinance was up for review, so we were able to comment and make comments in public meetings as to what direction that could take in terms of what are some of the conservation requirements for stormwater management in people's homes. You could even run for office with a wetland conservation platform. If you have the means, you can donate to wetland conservation organizations, engage in conversations with your friends and raise awareness about the issues and ways to contribute to being part of the solution. One of the main emerging threats that we have in the highland Andes right now is with lithium mining. Lithium is an element that's used for rechargeable batteries, so the market demand of that is increasing exponentially. And it's found in the brine dissolved in water in these wetlands. So there's a lot of activity happening around that. And this is to develop a green technology and green energy as an alternative to fossil fuel, right? So I think it's a good opportunity to make that a green or a more sustainable and a more responsible mining activity by asking about where the lithium is being sourced. When you're buying your electronics or electric vehicles, be aware that these elements are being mined. How are they being mined? What are the environmental and social impacts? And think about the whole system and what's the full life cycle of this battery? Where is it sourced? Is it recyclable? How is it disposed? How are the mines shutting down? There's ways to learn about the cycle and where things are being sourced and disposed of and stuff. So being an educated consumer.
Thank you. I like the whole cumulative approach. A lot of small differences together can really have a big and therefore impactful difference on habitat quality in the future. Felicity, that was absolutely fascinating. Thank you so much for giving your time up in your very busy schedule to come and talk about flamingo conservation and flamingo wetlands. And thank you again for supporting International Flamingo Day. It's been really nice to have an insight into the diverse nature of flamingo conservation. Yes, the birds are important, and yes, we love the birds, but it's everything else around them as well, which is really nice to hear that you can do some small things at home which will still make a difference to the flamingos out in the wild, even though they might be many thousands of miles away from where your actions are.
Yeah, especially like I said, there's the big global emerging threats are the lithium mining and of course climate change. So those are happening, to all of us every day. Even though the flamingo and then the wetlands appear to be remote, we're all now using rechargeable devices, and in some ways, we're all being affected by climate change.
And on that note, everybody can go away and look at their plumbing and make sure they've got no leaks, and check the quality and sustainability of their batteries. So, Felicity, once again, thank you very much.
Thank you, Paul. This was really fun.
Great to chat to you. Take care.
Thanks.
Bye.
Thanks.